My husband forced me to kneel and apologize to his mistress at our wedding. Then my father walked in. I never thought I would be the kind of woman who kneels on a marble floor in a wedding gown, begging forgiveness from another woman, while 300 guests watched in silence. But that is exactly what happened to me on what should have been the happiest day of my life. My name is Adeline Foster, and before I tell you what happened at my own wedding, let me tell you how I got there. Because none of it makes sense without the beginning. I met Jonathan Pierce 4 years ago at a charity gala my father had helped organize. My father, Harold Kirkland, was a well-known businessman in our city, a man who had built his company from nothing and who everyone respected for his fairness and his quiet strength. Jonathan walked into that gala like he owned the room. In a tailored navy suit, with a smile that made every woman turn her head. He found his way to me within 20 minutes. And by the end of the night, he had my number and my full attention. For the first year, Jonathan was everything a woman could dream of. He remembered small details. He sent flowers for no reason. He called my father sir and shook his hand firmly every single time they met. My mother adored him. My friends were jealous. I thought I had found the one man in the world who would never hurt me. I ignored the small things. The way he sometimes canceled plans last minute. The way his phone would buzz constantly and he would step outside to answer it. The way certain women at his office parties looked at him a little too long. And a little too knowingly. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself love meant trust, and trust meant not asking too many questions. My father was not so convinced. Harold Kirkland had spent 30 years reading people in boardrooms. And he told me once, quietly, over dinner, that something about Jonathan did not sit right with him. He said Jonathan smiled too easily when he was caught in a lie. That a man who explains himself before he is even accused of anything is usually hiding something. I brushed it off. I told my father he was being overprotective. That not every man who charmed a room was hiding secrets. I wish now that I had listened to him sooner. But hindsight has a cruelty of its own. Jonathan proposed on a beach during a trip to celebrate my birthday. He got down on one knee in front of a small bonfire, the waves crashing behind him. And he told me I was the only woman who had ever truly understood him. I said yes without hesitation. I remember calling my father that same night, so excited I could barely speak clearly. And my father congratulated me. But there was a pause in his voice. A small silence before he said he was happy for me. That told me he still had his doubts. I chose not to hear it. I chose to believe in the fairy tale I had built in my mind. The wedding planning took almost a year. My mother and I picked out invitations together, arguing over shades of ivory and gold. My father insisted on paying for everything himself, saying his only daughter deserved the finest wedding this city had ever seen. We booked the grand ballroom at the Whitmore Estate, a beautiful old building with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers that had hosted weddings for 3 generations of prominent families. Everything was falling into place. I should have known that. Something so perfect on the surface was hiding cracks underneath. About 2 months before the wedding, I started noticing a woman named Scarlett Devereux appearing more and more in Jonathan's life. At first she was just a coworker he mentioned in passing, someone from the marketing department, who was helping him with a big client presentation. Then she started showing up in photos from his work events, always standing a little too close, always laughing a little too loudly at his jokes. When I asked him about her, he waved his hand and said she was just a friend, that I was being insecure, that I needed to trust him more if our marriage was going to work. I apologized to him. I actually apologized for asking a simple question about a woman I had every right to be curious about. Looking back, that apology was the first time I knelt to him, long before the wedding day itself. The night before the wedding, I could not sleep. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange, heavy unease settle in my chest. I told myself it was just wedding nerves, that every bride feels this way the night before her life changes forever. I did not know then that my life was about to change in a way I never could have imagined, and not because of a wedding, but because of a betrayal so public and so cruel that it would follow me for the rest of my life. The morning of the wedding was a blur of hairspray, tears of joy from my mother, and my father standing in the doorway of my room in his black tuxedo, looking at me like I was still his little girl. He told me I looked like my mother did on their wedding day, and his eyes glistened, though he tried to hide it by clearing his throat and looking away. He held my hand as we walked toward the car that would take us to the ceremony, and he squeezed it once, gently, and said, "If anything ever feels wrong, even on this day, you come find me." I did not understand then how much I would need those words within just a few hours. The ceremony itself went beautifully. Jonathan stood at the altar looking handsome and composed, and when I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I saw tears in Jonathan's eyes. And for a moment, all my doubts disappeared. We exchanged vows. We kissed as husband and wife. Everyone clapped and cheered, and I thought, this is it. This is the beginning of my happily ever after. If only I had known what was waiting for me at the reception. The reception was held in the same grand ballroom, transformed with white and gold decorations, round tables covered in silk cloths, and a dance floor gleaming under the chandeliers. Dinner went smoothly. Toasts were given. My father gave a speech that made half the room cry, talking about watching me grow from a little girl who used to follow him around his office asking questions about business, into a strong, kind woman who had found love. Jonathan's parents gave a toast too, and Jonathan himself stood up and thanked everyone for coming, thanked his parents, thanked my parents, and then, almost as an afterthought, thanked his colleague Scarlett Devereux for helping organize some of the wedding logistics with the venue. I remember feeling a small twist in my stomach at her name being mentioned at all, but I told myself it was nothing, that he was simply being polite. It was during the first dance that everything began to unravel. Jonathan and I were swaying together to our song, and I noticed his eyes kept drifting toward a table near the back of the ballroom. I followed his gaze and saw Scarlett Devereux sitting there, in a deep red dress that stood out sharply against the white and gold decorations of the room, a dress far too bold, far too attention-seeking for a guest at someone else's wedding. She was watching us dance with an expression I can only describe as smug satisfaction, like she knew something the rest of the room did not. After the dance, Jonathan excused himself, saying he needed to speak with a groomsman about something. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, sipping champagne, trying to shake the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. A few minutes later, one of the bridesmaids came up to me, her face pale, and whispered that I needed to come to the side hallway immediately. My heart began pounding before I even understood why. I walked toward the hallway just off the ballroom, and there I found Jonathan standing with Scarlett Devereux, and they were not simply talking. Scarlett had tears streaming down her face, and Jonathan was holding her hands, whispering something to her that I could not hear. When he saw me approaching, his expression shifted from tenderness to something colder, something calculated. And what he said next is a moment I will never forget as long as I live. He told me that Scarlett had been in love with him for over a year, that they had grown close while working together, and that on the day of our wedding, the least I could do, as his new wife, was show her some respect and apologize for, in his words, stealing him away from her without ever acknowledging her feelings. I stood there in my wedding gown, stunned into silence, unable to process what I was hearing. This man, my husband of only a few hours, was standing in a hallway telling me I owed an apology to the woman he had apparently been carrying on an emotional affair with throughout our entire engagement. I tried to walk away, my hands shaking, but Jonathan grabbed my wrist. Not hard enough to hurt me physically, but firm enough to stop me in my tracks. And his voice dropped low and cold as he said that if I truly loved him, if I truly wanted our marriage to start on the right foot, I would show Scarlett the respect of kneeling and apologizing for the pain I had unknowingly caused her. He said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, as though he were asking me to pass the salt at dinner, rather than asking me to humiliate myself in front of everyone I loved. I want you to understand something. In that moment, I was not thinking clearly. I had been raised to believe that marriage meant compromise, that a good wife smooths things over, that conflict on a wedding day was something to be avoided at all costs so as not to embarrass the family. Some small, broken part of me, the part that had spent months brushing off red flags and apologizing for having doubts, told me that maybe if I just did this one thing, maybe if I just made this scene disappear quietly, our marriage could still start fresh. I am not proud of what happened next, but I will tell you honestly, because that is the only way this story means anything. Jonathan led me back into the main ballroom, his hand still wrapped around my wrist, and Scarlett Devereux followed behind us, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin from the dinner table. The music had been turned down, guests had noticed the tension, and a hush began to fall over the room. Jonathan stopped us near the center of the dance floor, in full view of everyone, and he looked at me with an expression that dared me to refuse him in front of 300 witnesses. He said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, that his wife had something she wanted to say to Scarlett. I felt every eye in that ballroom turn toward me. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My bridesmaids exchanged horrified glances. And I, Adeline Foster, newly married and utterly humiliated, felt my knees bend beneath the weight of my wedding gown as I lowered myself to the floor in front of Scarlett Devereux, and I began to say the words, I am sorry. I do not know how many words I managed to say before everything changed, because that is the exact moment the ballroom doors burst open, and my father, Harold Kirkland, walked in. He had stepped outside earlier to take an important phone call. One that, as I would soon learn, changed everything. He walked back into the ballroom, just in time to see his only daughter kneeling on the floor in her wedding dress, apologizing to a woman he had never even been introduced to, while his new son-in-law stood over her with his arms crossed like a king surveying his kingdom. My father did not shout. He did not run. He simply walked, slowly, deliberately, across that dance floor, and the entire room fell into a silence so complete you could hear the soft rustle of my gown as I turned to look at him. He reached down and took my hand, gently but firmly, and helped me to my feet. He looked at me first, his eyes searching mine, silently asking if I was hurt, if this was truly happening. Then he turned to Jonathan, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was calm in a way that was somehow far more frightening than shouting would have been. He asked Jonathan a single question. He asked him why his daughter was on her knees on her own wedding day. Jonathan, to his credit or perhaps to his own downfall, did not back down. He stood taller and said that Adeline owed Scarlett an apology because their relationship had caused Scarlett pain, that is the woman who had, in his words, won. The least I could do was show some grace. My father listened to every word without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly, and when Jonathan finished speaking, my father did something none of us expected. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. That phone call he had taken earlier, the one that pulled him away from the reception, had been from a private investigator he had quietly hired months earlier, after his instincts about Jonathan never fully went away, even as the wedding plans moved forward. My father, ever the careful businessman, had decided to look deeper into Jonathan Pierce, not out of malice, but out of love for me, because he could not shake the feeling that something was being hidden. What the investigator found was far worse than anyone could have guessed. Jonathan and Scarlett Devereux had been involved for over a year, not merely emotionally, but in every sense of the word. There were hotel receipts, message records, even a joint bank account Jonathan had opened with Scarlett months before our wedding, funded partially by money he had quietly withdrawn from accounts my father had generously gifted us as a wedding present. Scarlett had known about the wedding the entire time. She had not been some heartbroken bystander unknowingly hurt by our love story. She had been an active participant in a plan, one where she would show up at the wedding, play the victim, and manipulate Jonathan into publicly shaming me, perhaps hoping the humiliation would push me to call off the marriage myself, leaving Jonathan free and clear without him having to be the one to end things. My father held up his phone and, in front of every single guest in that ballroom, began to read aloud portions of the messages his investigator had gathered, messages between Jonathan and Scarlett discussing this very moment, discussing how satisfying it would be to watch me kneel, discussing how my father's money and reputation could still be useful to Jonathan, even after the marriage fell apart, as long as things were handled carefully. The room gasped in unison. My mother began to cry. Several guests stood up, some in shock, some already reaching for their coats. Jonathan's face went pale, then red, and he tried to grab the phone from my father's hand, sputtering that it was all taken out of context, that my father had no right to invade his privacy, that this was slander. My father simply stepped back, calm as ever, and said that a man who plans nothing has nothing to fear from the truth, but a man who plans everything fears it more than anything else in the world. Then he turned to me, still holding my hand, and asked me one final question in front of everyone. He asked if I wanted to stay in that marriage for even one more minute. I looked at Jonathan, standing there exposed, his carefully built image crumbling, in real time in front of everyone, who had once admired him. I looked at Scarlett, who was no longer crying, whose face had shifted from performed sorrow to cold calculation now that her plan had failed. And then I looked at my father, the man who had never stopped believing that something was wrong, who had quietly protected me even when I refused to see the truth myself. I took off the ring Jonathan had placed on my finger only hours earlier, and I handed it to him, and I said, in a voice steadier than I thought possible, that our marriage was over before it had even truly begun. The annulment was granted within weeks, given the extraordinary circumstances and the evidence my father had gathered. Jonathan lost more than just a wife that day. Word travels fast in business circles, and my father, without ever bad-mouthing Jonathan publicly, simply made sure the truth was known among the right people. Jonathan lost his job within 2 months, as his company did not take kindly to the scandal reaching local news outlets, especially once Scarlett's own manipulative role became public knowledge as well. Their relationship, built on secrecy and cruelty, did not survive the sudden spotlight either. I heard, through mutual friends, that they blamed each other for everything falling apart, that the very partnership built on humiliating me could not survive honesty being forced into the light. As for me, the months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. But also, strangely, some of the most clarifying. I moved back home for a while, into my old bedroom. The same one where I had lain awake the night before my wedding sensing that something was wrong. My father never once said the words "I told you so," though he certainly could have. Instead, he simply sat with me many evenings, letting me cry, letting me be angry, letting me process the fact that the love story I thought I was living had been, for Jonathan at least, a performance and a means to an end. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I threw myself into work, and with my father's guidance and my own determination, I eventually started my own small consulting firm. Something I had always dreamed of but never pursued while I was busy planning a wedding for a man who did not deserve the effort. My firm grew steadily, and within 2 years, I was standing on my own 2 feet. Not because a man had built a foundation for me, but because I had built it myself, brick by brick. With my father cheering quietly from the sidelines the way he always had. People often ask me if I hate Jonathan and Scarlett for what they did. I would be lying if I said there were not nights in the beginning, when anger consumed me completely. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest wounds. And my father always taught me that carrying hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. Today, I do not hate them. I feel, if anything, a strange kind of gratitude. Because that humiliating moment on the dance floor, that moment I knelt in my wedding gown, ended up being the moment that freed me from a life that would have slowly chipped away at who I truly was. My father walking through those doors did not just save me from finishing an apology I never should have started. He saved me from an entire future built on lies. I eventually met someone else, years later, a quiet, steady man named Nathaniel who works as an architect and who, on our first date, asked me thoughtful questions and actually listened to my answers. Who has never once asked me to shrink myself for his comfort. We are engaged now, and yes, I still get nervous thinking about walking down another aisle, but this time, I know myself far too well to ever kneel for anyone who does not deserve it. My father will walk me down the aisle again soon. And this time, I know there will be no doors bursting open. Because I have learned to trust my own instincts long before anyone else has to save me. If you are listening to this and you have ever found yourself apologizing for things that were never your fault, if you have ever felt that small voice inside you whispering that something is wrong even when everyone around you insists everything is fine, please listen to that voice. Trust it the way I eventually learned to trust mine. And if you have a parent, a friend, or anyone in your life who has quietly protected you the way my father protected me, tell them you love them today, because you may not always know how much they are doing behind the scenes to keep you safe. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If this story touched your heart, let me know where you are watching from. Comment your city down below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you love your grandma, if stories like mine remind you of the strength of the women who came before us, then please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with your friends and family. There are so many more stories where this one came from, and I cannot wait to share them with you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and never be afraid to trust your own heart.